The market is too saturated is the biggest excuse I hear from small business owners and entrepreneurs. And it's generally a myth unless you're an enormous company. And here's why. Market saturation is a factor if you're an enormous business and you're looking to start a new product, especially if you want to make big plays and take over a substantial part of that market. The more competitors and the bigger their hold, the harder it is for you to get in, especially in certain markets where differentiating is very, very difficult. For big companies, this is a huge consideration. But in most cases, they would prefer to enter a saturated market than the alternative. And because these big companies talk about market saturation so much, small businesses and entrepreneurs like to think that it's something that they should be concerned about too, when they shouldn't. You see, the alternative to entering a saturated market is far more difficult. Even Apple would prefer to enter a saturated market, and they have done quite a bit. Apple is famous for entering markets late in the game, but with a product that is substantially better than the competition, at least in the eyes of the general consumer that they're trying to hit. And other companies not as big as Apple or with as much of a force as Apple will generally focus on filling gaps in that marketplace or overlapping with multiple competitors in that marketplace to try and carve out a gap. They're not afraid of market saturation, it's just a metric that they need to be concerned about. And this is because the alternative is a huge issue. And it's something that Google, Apple, Microsoft, huge companies have a real problem with. Because the alternative to entering a saturated market is to create a new one. Because by definition, if a company like Apple wants to get into a market, it either doesn't exist or it's already saturated, because the markets that they're looking at are massive. They're not trying to get 100,000 consumers, they're trying to get millions and millions of consumers per year. And for those consumers to exist, there has to already be a massive market, which likely means it's saturated because there's opportunity, or they have to create a market, which is more difficult. Because if you decide to create a market, you not only have to create a brilliant product, you also have to educate consumers as to why they need this new brilliant product. Now, the argument can be that brilliant products sell themselves, and that is true in a saturated market. But if a consumer doesn't know they have a need, then they're not going to spend money fixing that need. And therefore, you have to educate that customer and reach that customer. Even for companies like Apple and Google, this is incredibly difficult. And huge companies fail at this all the time. Google Glass, for example, from a few years back, is one that stands out in the technology sector. But there are tons and tons of examples. And there are companies that succeed at it, but it takes an enormous amount of difficulty. Look at the Apple Vision Pro right now and the amount of effort Apple is making to entertain and educate customers in that market. And that's not even a brand new market. That is one that is already built by the likes of Oculus and Facebook, but is too small. So they're trying to educate a massive audience to try and create a massive market. And this is why the likes of Zuckerberg are excited about Apple entering the space more than concerned, because they are hoping Apple will do that difficult work for them. And even if Apple saturate that new market with their product, they know they can take a share of those customers. And this is why all of the time the biggest companies will wait for others to do that dirty work. Let's look at Apple once again. The Apple Watch was nothing new. Samsung and other Android companies had been building smartwatches for years by the time the Apple Watch came in. And that meant that Samsung and all of these Android companies had built up a huge customer base of tens of millions of watches per year, enough for Apple to know that they could at least recoup their investment without an enormous struggle. And then what did they do? They just built a better version of what was already on the market by looking at the most important part. Why do people buy smartwatches? They could go out, do market research on a market that already existed, and then create a perfect product to fit a subsection of that market. and they killed it. They absolutely destroyed that market. Whereas for years and years, Samsung and others had tried to kind of slowly eke out a smartwatch market, and they did all of the groundwork only for Apple to take the majority of the success for years to come. So if big companies don't want to build new markets, and if big companies are happy with market saturation, you as a small business owner or entrepreneur would be absolutely mental to try and build your own new product unless you have massive backing. You want a saturated market. It means there is already a market that has millions of consumers. It means there is already a market that there is research for and that is widely understood. There is a need that you can fill. So the customers are already there. And even better than that, because the market is saturated, it means that a lot of the companies who will become your competitors are following more or less the same formula. So you can stand out in a crowd by simply coming up with something more unique than the rest. The world is full of restaurants and bars, and yet new ones open every day that succeed. The simple truth is, market saturation for small businesses and entrepreneurs is generally an excuse. If market saturation is the key element putting you off your product or service, it's likely an excuse because you know that your product or service simply isn't good enough. The problem doesn't lie with market saturation, it lies with your product or service. And thus, if the market is saturated, it's usually because there is an enormous market. So instead of seeing the excuse, simply see the opportunity here. If the market is saturated like this, then it means that most small businesses and entrepreneurs are probably thinking the same way that you are right now. They're thinking that the market's saturated, they won't be able to stand out, and they should think about a different one. And instead, you can bring something new, something unique that meets a gap or overlaps 2 or 3 existing competitors in that marketplace. And you have the advantage of being smaller, more agile, and willing to try things and fail. You just need something so good that a small percentage of that pie see how good you are compared to the boring competitors in the saturated marketplace. And then you can eat your piece. So don't look at it as an excuse. Look at it as an opportunity. And most importantly, subscribe.